October 1955. One of the greatest voices in American history couldn't get through the door of a Los Angeles nightclub. Not because she wasn't talented enough, not because she wasn't famous enough, but because her skin was the wrong color. Ella Fitzgerald, the First Lady of Song, was being turned away from the Mocambo because the owner said she didn't have the right image for his sophisticated white clientele. Then Marilyn Monroe picked up the phone. What she said in that 3-minute call would break down racial barriers, launch one of the greatest friendships in entertainment history, and prove that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is open a door for someone else. This is the untold story of the night Marilyn Monroe sat in the front row and changed everything. The Mocambo nightclub sat on Sunset Strip like a jewel in a crown. Everyone who was anyone performed there. Frank Sinatra had packed the house. Judy Garland had brought audiences to tears. The club's owner, Charlie Morrison, was proud of his establishment. Proud of the famous faces that filled his tables every night. Proud of the exclusive atmosphere he had created. But there was something Charlie Morrison was even prouder of, though he would never say it out loud. His club was for white performers only. Oh, he had excuses when black artists tried to book shows. The schedule was full. The style wasn't right. The audience wouldn't appreciate it, but everyone in Hollywood knew what those excuses really meant. Ella Fitzgerald knew. She had been trying to get booked at the Mocambo for 2 years. Ella was 38 years old in October 1955, and she had already changed music forever. Her voice could do things that seemed impossible. She could scat sing like an instrument. She could hit notes that made other singers shake their heads in wonder. She had sold millions of records, performed for presidents, won every award the music industry had to offer. But none of that mattered to Charlie Morrison, because Ella was black, and she was heavy, and she wore plain dresses instead of glamorous gowns, and in Charlie Morrison's mind, that meant she didn't fit the Mocambo's image. Norman Granz, Ella's manager, was furious. He had been calling the Mocambo every month for 2 years, and every month he got the same polite rejection. Norman knew racism when he saw it, even when it wore a smile and spoke in soft excuses. But Norman was also practical. He knew that arguing wouldn't change Charlie Morrison's mind. What would change his mind was money, and publicity, and the guarantee that booking Ella would be the best business decision Charlie ever made. Norman needed leverage. He needed someone so famous that Charlie Morrison couldn't say no. Someone who could guarantee that every photographer in Los Angeles would show up. Someone whose presence would make headlines across America. He needed Marilyn Monroe. Norman had met Marilyn a few months earlier at a Hollywood party. They had talked for hours about music and art and what it felt like to be underestimated. Marilyn was the biggest movie star in the world, but she was still fighting to be taken seriously as an actress. Ella was one of the greatest singers alive, but she was still fighting to be seen as more than her race. When Norman called Marilyn to explain what was happening at the Mocambo, she didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She simply said, "What do you need me to do?" Norman laid out his plan. "I need you to call Charlie Morrison. Tell him that if he books Ella, you'll sit in the front row every single night of her engagement. Tell him you'll make sure the press knows you're there. Tell him this will be the biggest publicity his club has ever seen." There was silence on the phone line. Norman held his breath. What he was asking wasn't small. Marilyn would have to spend a week of her life at a nightclub. She would have to deal with photographers and reporters constantly. She would have to use her fame to help someone else. And she would have to do it publicly, which meant taking a stand on race in America in 1955, which could damage her career. "Give me his number," Marilyn said. "I'll call him right now." But here's what Norman didn't know yet. Here's what would make this story even more powerful. Marilyn Monroe had grown up in foster homes in Los Angeles. She had spent her childhood being shuffled from house to house, never quite fitting in, never quite being wanted. She knew what it felt like to stand outside a door that wouldn't open. She knew what it felt like to be told you weren't good enough, weren't the right type, didn't fit the image. When Norman told her about Ella being rejected from the Mocambo, Marilyn didn't just hear about racism. She heard an echo of her own childhood. She heard every door that had been slammed in her face, every time someone had looked at her and decided she wasn't worth their time. And she decided that if she now had the power to open doors, she was damn well going to use it. 20 minutes after talking to Norman, Marilyn was on the phone with Charlie Morrison. She didn't ask. She didn't beg. She told him exactly how things were going to be. "Charlie," she said, her voice pleasant but absolutely firm, "you're going to book Ella Fitzgerald at the Mocambo for 1 week, and I'm going to sit in the front row every single night. Do you understand what that means?" Charlie Morrison understood perfectly. It meant photographers camping outside his door every night. It meant Marilyn Monroe's face in every newspaper in America, with the Mocambo's name in the caption. It meant every star in Hollywood would want to be at his club to be photographed near Marilyn. It meant money beyond his wildest dreams, but it also meant booking a black singer. It meant potentially upsetting his white customers. It meant changing the way his club operated. "Marilyn," Charlie said carefully, "you know I respect Ella's talent, but my clientele expects a certain atmosphere." "Your clientele," Marilyn interrupted, and her voice had steel in it now, "expects to see me, and I will only be at the Mocambo if Ella Fitzgerald is on that stage. So you need to decide right now, Charlie. Are you going to book the greatest singer in America? Or are you going to be the man who turned down Marilyn Monroe?" When she put it that way, there was only one answer Charlie Morrison could give. "She can start next week," he said. The night of November 8th, 1955 changed everything, but nobody knew that yet when the doors opened. Marilyn arrived at the Mocambo 30 minutes before showtime. She wore a dress that sparkled under the lights, knew the photographers would love. She had done her hair and makeup with extra care. This wasn't just any night at a nightclub. This was a statement. This was history. She walked to her table at the very front of the stage, right in the center, right where every camera could see her clearly, right where she would be impossible to ignore. The club filled up fast. Everyone had heard that Marilyn Monroe would be at the Mocambo that night. Photographers jammed the entrance. Reporters took notes. Movie stars and directors and producers all fought for tables, desperate to be photographed in the same room as Marilyn. Charlie Morrison stood at the back of his club, watching the chaos, and realized that Marilyn had been right. This was going to be the biggest night in the Mocambo's history. But then the lights dimmed, and Ella Fitzgerald walked onto the stage. Ella saw Marilyn immediately, saw her sitting there in the front row, smiling up at the stage. And Ella had to take a moment to steady herself, because she understood what Marilyn had done. She understood what it cost Marilyn to be there, and she understood that without Marilyn's phone call, she would still be locked out of this room. Ella opened her mouth and began to sing, and the entire club went silent. Her voice filled every corner of that room. It wrapped around every person at every table. It made the photographers forget about their cameras. It made the movie stars forget about being seen. It made Charlie Morrison realize that maybe, just maybe, his ideas about image and atmosphere had been wrong all along. Marilyn sat at her table listening, and tears ran down her face. She had heard Ella's records, of course. Everyone had. But hearing that voice in person, feeling it vibrate in your chest, watching Ella's face as she sang, that was something else entirely. That was witnessing greatness. The audience sat transfixed through the first song. By the second song, They were leaning forward in their seats. By the third song, they forgot this was supposed to be about Marilyn Monroe. This was about Ella Fitzgerald, about a voice that could break your heart and put it back together in the space of a single note. When Ella finished her first set, the applause was deafening. People stood. They shouted for more. They demanded encores. Charlie Morrison stood at the back of his club, watching his sophisticated white customers go absolutely crazy for a black singer, and felt something shift in his understanding of the world. But the real magic happened during the break. Ella came down from the stage and walked directly to Marilyn's table. The two women looked at each other for a long moment. Then Ella said, very quietly so only Marilyn could hear, "Thank you. You didn't have to do this." Marilyn reached out and took Ella's hand. "Yes, I did," she said, "because you deserve to be on that stage, and anyone who can't see that is a fool." That's when their friendship began. Not as publicity, not as a Hollywood moment for the cameras, but as two women who recognized something in each other, who understood what it meant to be underestimated, who knew what it cost to keep fighting when the world kept telling you no. Marilyn came back the next night, and the next night, and every night for the entire week of Ella's engagement. She kept her promise completely. The newspapers went insane. Every major publication in America ran photographs of Marilyn at the Mocambo. And right next to those photos were stories about Ella Fitzgerald's triumph, about the greatest voice in America finally getting the recognition she deserved, about sold-out shows and standing ovations and a barrier that was starting to crack. Other clubs in Los Angeles took notice. If the Mocambo could book a black performer and become the hottest spot in town, maybe they should reconsider their own policies. Within 6 months, clubs across Los Angeles that had been closed to black performers started opening their doors. The walls of segregation didn't come crashing down overnight, but they started to crack, and it started with a movie star making a phone call. But there's more to this story, because Marilyn and Ella didn't just pose for photographs together, they became real friends. After the Mocambo engagement ended, they stayed in touch. Marilyn would call Ella just to talk, long conversations about life and love and loneliness. Ella would tell Marilyn stories about her own struggles in the music business. Marilyn would confide in Ella about her difficult marriages and her fights with the studios. Sometimes when Marilyn couldn't sleep, she would call Ella late at night, and Ella would talk to her, would tell her jokes, would sometimes sing to her over the phone, soft lullabies that helped Marilyn finally rest. When Marilyn was going through her divorce from Joe DiMaggio, Ella was one of the few people she could talk to honestly. When Ella faced her own challenges and disappointments, Marilyn was there with quiet support and fierce loyalty. But what happened at the Mocambo wasn't just about friendship. It was about power and how you use it. Marilyn Monroe in 1955 was probably the most famous woman in the world. She could have used that fame for anything. She could have stayed quiet on controversial issues. She could have protected her image and her career by avoiding anything that might upset part of her audience. That's what her studio wanted. That's what her managers advised. That's what most white stars in Hollywood did. Instead, Marilyn used her power to open a door. She used her privilege to help someone who deserved it. She risked her own career to fight an injustice, and she did it not for publicity or credit, but because it was right. The consequences were real. Marilyn received hate mail from racists who thought she shouldn't have helped a black performer. Some radio stations in the South stopped playing music from her movies. Some theaters threatened to stop showing her films. Marilyn's studio executives were angry that she had taken a political stand without consulting them. But Marilyn never apologized, never backed down. When reporters asked her about it, she said simply, "Ella Fitzgerald is the greatest singer I've ever heard. Everyone should have the chance to hear her perform live. I'm glad I could help make that happen. Years later, Ella would talk about that week at the Mocambo and what it meant to her career. I owe Marilyn Monroe a debt I can never repay, Ella said. She was an unusual woman, a little ahead of her times, and she didn't know it. I loved her. After that, I never had to play a small jazz club again. She was incredible. That last part was important. After the Mocambo, Ella's career in America transformed completely. She started getting bookings at major venues that had been closed to her. She started being treated with the respect her talent had always deserved. She went from being a black singer to being recognized as one of the greatest artists of her generation, period. The friendship between Marilyn and Ella continued until Marilyn's death in 1962. When Marilyn died, Ella was devastated. She released a statement that said, "The world has lost a great beauty and a great talent, but I have lost a friend. Someone who understood what it meant to fight for your place in the world. Someone who used her power for good. I will miss her forever." Ella continued performing for decades after Marilyn's death. She won 13 Grammy Awards. She sold over 40 million records. She performed for presidents and kings. She became recognized as one of the greatest vocalists in the history of music. But she never forgot October 1955. Never forgot the blonde movie star who sat in the front row and opened a door. The story of Marilyn and Ella matters because it shows us something we often forget. It shows us that Marilyn Monroe was more than a sex symbol or a tragic figure. She was someone who understood injustice and was willing to fight it. She was someone who had power and used it for something bigger than herself. And it reminds us that fame and influence are meaningless unless you do something good with them. Marilyn could have stayed comfortable and safe. She could have avoided controversy. She could have focused only on her own career and her own struggles. Instead, she made a 3-minute phone call. She kept a week-long promise. She sat in the front row and opened a door. And in doing so, she changed someone's life, helped transform an industry, and showed the world what real courage looks like. In 1955, most of white Hollywood stayed silent on racial injustice. Most white stars protected their images and their careers by avoiding anything controversial. But Marilyn Monroe made a different choice. She decided that being famous meant having a platform, and having a platform meant having a responsibility. She didn't make grand speeches about civil rights. She didn't organize protests or write manifestos. She simply picked up the phone, made a promise, and kept it. Sometimes that's all it takes. Sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is use your privilege to help someone who doesn't have it. Ella Fitzgerald once said, "The only thing better than singing is more singing." But maybe the only thing better than having power is using that power to help someone else shine. That's what Marilyn did for Ella. And that's why this story matters 70 years later. When we look at photographs of Marilyn Monroe, we usually see the glamorous movie star, the blonde bombshell, the sex symbol. But when we look at the story of Marilyn and Ella, we see something else. We see a woman with principles, a woman with courage, a woman who understood that the doors that had been slammed in her face as a child meant she had a responsibility to open doors for others when she finally had the power to do it. One phone call in October 1955 broke down barriers that had stood for decades. 1 week of sitting in the front row changed the trajectory of one of the greatest careers in music history. One friendship between two women showed the world that courage doesn't always look like you expect it to. Sometimes courage is a blonde movie star picking up the phone and saying, "This isn't right and I'm going to do something about it." Marilyn Monroe had fame, beauty, and power. And when it mattered, she used all three to do something good. She didn't ask for credit. She didn't make it about herself. She simply saw an injustice and decided to act. That's the story they don't tell in most Marilyn Monroe documentaries. That's the story that gets buried under discussions of her marriages and her movies and her tragic death. But it might be the most important story about who Marilyn Monroe really was. She was someone who remembered what it felt like to be locked out. And when she finally had the key, she opened the door. If this story changed how you see Marilyn Monroe, if it made you think about how you use whatever power you have, then subscribe to our channel for more untold stories about the moments that mattered. Hit that like button if you believe in opening doors for others. And tell us in the comments, how can you use your own influence, whatever it is, to help someone else? Because that's what this story is really about. Not fame or Hollywood or even Marilyn Monroe. It's about recognizing that we all have some kind of power. And what matters is what we choose to do with it. In October 1955, Marilyn Monroe chose to open a door, and the world has been better for it ever since.